Hey guys, you'll be taking a look as to how much of a difference we've seen in the standing of both Republicans and Democrats nationwide for the 2022 elections in just the last 3 months over the summer. When we first entered the summer months, the Democratic Party were expected to be trounced by the GOP, especially in the House elections. And if you look at the Senate elections, the Republican Party had a 60% chance at controlling the Senate after this year's midterms. However, the opposite has now happened after the last couple of months. The Democrats now have a 61% chance at winning, and it is not just this forecast. If you look at the betting markets as well, the Democratic Party now has a 60% chance at controlling the Senate, just 40 for the Republicans. And if you look at the overall trend over the last 90 days, you see something that's very similar. The Republican Party were heavily favored over the last year or so. However, their lead has shrunk now to a deficit very quickly in just the last couple of weeks. And if you look at the national generic ballot numbers, you see a very similar story. The GOP had been leading in this metric for almost a year, since all the way back in November. However, just recently, over the last couple of days, they lost their lead, and Democrats are now ahead nationwide by a margin of 0.3%. And so as a result of all of this, Democrats may defy history with Joe Biden as the incumbent president and actually expand upon their majority in the Senate and gain in the amount of governorships that they control. Now, they're still likely to lose the House. I'll go over why in a moment here, but the Democratic Party is doing much better than they should be. If you look at the last couple of midterm elections, the incumbent party in the White House always does poorly after first being elected. If you look at the 2018 Senate elections, now 2018 was actually an anomaly. The Republican Party had a very favorable map. I mean, just look at the amount of states Democrats had to defend. If you look at the flip states on this map, you'll understand why the Republicans were able to actually expand the majority by 1 seat. If you look at 3 of the 4 flips for the GOP, they were in North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana. All 3 of these states voted for Donald Trump by solid margins in 2016, and even though Claire McCaskill and Joe Donnelly were pretty popular senators, they just could not overcome the fact that the GOP had become so popular in these states as a whole. Florida was the only major flip for the Republican Party that was actually impressive. Bill Nelson was running for his 5th term, and he was actually defeated by Rick Scott, and this was just a sign that Florida was going to continue to shift to the right. The 2 flips with the Democrats were in Nevada with Jackie Rosen defeating Dean Heller and Kyrsten Sinema defeating Martha McSally in Arizona. And so both of these wins for Democrats were much more important than the 3 wins for Republicans in North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana. And on top of that, Democrats actually did pretty well. They were able to defend their seats in Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. Montana and West Virginia were both very solid Democratic states, and Ohio has shifted to the right by 11 points from 2012 to 2016. And if you look at the other races in the Midwest, I mean, basically, all of the upper Rust Belt Democratic incumbents won by pretty large margins, considering that Trump won 3 of these states in 2016. Now, the GOP may have been able to retain their majority in the upper chamber. If you look at the other elections in 2018, they were pretty disastrous for the Republican Party. Looking at the governor elections, I mean, 7 flips for the Democratic Party nationwide, with the big one being in Kansas. The Republican Party lost the Kansas governorship in 2018. They also lost many races in Illinois, Michigan, and even Wisconsin with the election of Tony Evers over Scott Walker. And of course, in Alaska, this was the only flip for the GOP, but this is because Mike Dunleavy won his election after Bill Walker, the independent, did not run for re-election. If you look at the House elections, I mean, not any better for the Republican Party in 2018. 46 flips for the Democrats. Just look at how much more blue there is going from 2016 to 2018. And Michigan and Pennsylvania were actually tied for both parties after this midterm. And if you look at the nationwide numbers, Democrats won by almost 9%, with Nancy Pelosi becoming the Speaker of the House once again. And if you look at generic ballot numbers in 2018, Democrats were up by 8.6%. So the generic ballot polls were almost spot on 4 years ago, and the Democrats had a major electoral victory. And if you look at the election in 2010, you will see a very similar story. In 2010, this was 2 years after the election of Barack Obama in 2008. 2008, Democrats won over 250 seats, and in 2010, 67 flips for the Republican Party just 2 years later. And so after this point, the Democratic Party under Barack Obama would never regain the majority in the House. If we look at the 2002 elections, another big anomaly. I mean, George W. Bush was elected in 2000, and he became the most popular president ever after 9/11, and so we had a rally around the leader effect after the attack. And of course, in 2002, American politics was much less polarized, so the Republican Party was able to defy history and expand their majority in both the House and the Senate. They did well in the governor elections as well. However, if you go back to 1994, 2 years after the election of Bill Clinton, 58 flips for the Republican Party. This, of course, was the Republican Revolution of 1994, and this was the first time that the GOP won the majority in the House for decades. So this trend of the incumbent party losing the midterms 2 years later, it really is a recent one that started with the election of Bill Clinton and then the midterm in 1994, but it is something that has stayed true pretty much ever since, and so that is why Joe Biden is not likely to see that great of a showing after these midterms. Yes, they may win the Senate, but on the House level, the Democratic Party is still expected to be trounced. And so when we look at the Senate and House elections right next to each other, we see a major discrepancy between these two races. Democrats are slightly favored to win the Senate, while in the House, Republicans have a clear advantage. And the reason for this is, of course, hyper-partisanship in the House elections, something that does not exist as much for the Senate elections. In the Senate, candidates matter a lot more. Senators are going to be much more important than individual representatives. Of course, there are 435 reps, while there are only 100 senators. And so if we look at the candidates that the GOP has put up this year, we will see why the Republican Party is doing so poorly in the Senate. If they had nominated even just average candidates, they would be in a much better position. But if you look at the House elections right now, Republicans are basically guaranteed to win the House majority back, with Kevin McCarthy as the Speaker of the House, which of course would make it so that Nancy Pelosi is going to have to retire as Speaker, and she's probably not going to win it ever again. And so if we look at the forecast and how it's changed over the last couple of months, Democrats now have a 21% chance of winning. This is up from the 14 that they had at the very beginning of this forecast, and currently Democrats are expected to win just 204 seats, so around a 10 to 20 seat flip for the Republican Party. And nationwide, 530 still expects the GOP to win the popular vote by 4.2%. Now, if Democrats do pull off a win in the House, I do believe Nancy Pelosi will be reelected as the Speaker of the House. I mean, if she can overcome these odds for her party, that means that she should retain the speakership, although it is almost impossible that that happens. The Republican Party is pretty much guaranteed to win. If you look at this forecast based on the polls, things are a little bit better for Democrats, but really not too much. Republicans are still favored to win, and if you look at the classic model, they have a 79% chance of winning, so the same as the deluxe model that we see here. And now if we look at the Senate elections, we've seen a much more fluid race between both parties. Democrats, of course, basically flip the odds upside down when they now have a 61% chance of winning. The average number of seats controlled by each party sits at 50 for both, and of course this means that Democrats would retain the control of the upper chamber. And if you look at each of the individual races here, Democrats are doing much better than they should be. I mean, they're favored in both Georgia and Nevada, and North Carolina is becoming one of the closest races that we have. It is as competitive as both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. John Fetterman has the same chance at flipping Pennsylvania that Ron Johnson has of retaining and winning re-election in Wisconsin. And so if we look at many of the other races, I mean, Blake Masters has just a 29% chance at flipping Arizona, 71 for incumbent Mark Kelly. That is the position that Republicans are in right now. If we look at each of the individual states on our map here, the Democratic Party, 71% chance of winning in Arizona, 67 in Pennsylvania, 51 in Georgia, and 57 in Nevada. All four of these races were said to be the closest races that we had, but at this point, North Carolina is just as competitive as the other four, as well as Wisconsin. Both of these races were very much likely states at the very beginning of this forecast. And if you look at the Ohio election, J.D. Vance now only has a 75% chance of winning. When his odds go down to 74, the Ohio race will also only be lean for the Republican Party. So Democrats, they're expected to win Pennsylvania. This would be a flip for them, and as long as they hold on to two states in the three out of Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, they will retain the majority. I think that winning Arizona and Nevada is going to be difficult, but not as difficult as it really may seem. Both of these states are much more Democratic than they were just a couple of decades ago. Yes, Nevada is not seeing the best trend for Democrats, but at this point in time, it is still more of a Democratic state than a Republican one. And finally, looking at the governor elections, we see something that's pretty similar to what we're seeing in the Senate. Democrats are increasing their chances in many of these races, and just like the Senate elections, partisanship matters less than in the House. The individual candidates themselves have a major effect on these races. If we look at the individual races, I mean, we see the closest ones are Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, surprisingly, as well as the elections in New Mexico and Maine. So these races are all favoring Democrats currently. Even in Kansas, Laura Kelly is expected to win her re-election. She has a 52% chance of winning. I think this is a pretty accurate projection here. Yes, the Republicans are still probably going to win Kansas in my opinion, but just based on the polling right now, the Democratic Party is doing pretty well. And if you look at many of the other races on this map, in Nevada, Steve Sisolak has a 62% chance at winning re-election. This is another one of those very close races. In Oregon, we have a surprisingly close one. This is because it's a three-way race between Tina Cote, Christine Drazan, and Betsy Johnson. Johnson is taking away a lot of the liberal vote. In Arizona, Katie Hobbs has a 59% chance at defeating Carrie Lake. In New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, 80% chance of winning. She's not that great of a candidate. I think that probably one of the worst ones the Democrats have on the ballot this November. In Florida, of course, it's likely for Ron DeSantis, as well as in Georgia for Brian Kemp. And in the state of Maine, Janet Mills has an 81% chance at defeating Paula Page. I mean, if you want to look at more competitive races, of course, all four of the races in the upper Midwest. In Minnesota, Tim Walz, 89% chance that he wins re-election and defeats Scott Jensen. In Wisconsin, Tony Evers has an 80% chance of winning. I mean, this would be a major win for the Democratic Party when he runs against Tim Michaels. I've been told that is the pronunciation. And if you look at how the odds have changed, I think the 538 forecast has always overestimated Tony Evers. I don't think he's that great of a candidate. I do think that if the Republicans went with Rebecca Kleefisch, I think they would have had a much better chance. But Tony Evers is not that special of a governor. And I mean, in a year like 2022, it will be difficult for him to win. The last time that a Democrat won a governor election in Wisconsin with a Democratic president in office was in 1962 when JFK was the president. In Michigan, we have not a competitive election at all here, with Gretchen Whitmer having a 95% chance at winning her second term. And in Pennsylvania, where there is no incumbent, Josh Shapiro has an 85% chance at defeating Doug Mastriano. So once again, just like the Senate elections, Democrats are in a very good position going into the gubernatorial elections. And if they see a gain in the amount of governorships that they hold, because they're going to flip both Massachusetts as well as Maryland with no Republican incumbents running, the Democratic Party could defy the odds, and actually this would not be a red wave year for Republicans at all. And if we look at the approval rating of Joe Biden, we're seeing an upward trend for Democrats as well here, with Biden having now a 40.3% approval rating, 55.6% disapproval rating, and the numbers have gone up significantly since the middle of the summer, where he had a negative 20% approval rating overall in the negatives. Now he has a negative 15% overall net approval, and for the first time in almost 2 months, Joe Biden is now approved of by over 40% of the country. And so, of course, Joe Biden has basically been continuously going down over the last 2 years. But as we approach the midterms, if Democrats can keep up this trend with Joe Biden becoming more popular, they really could stand a chance. I mean, just recently, Democrats passed 3 major bills. They also killed the leader of Al-Qaeda, the successor to Osama bin Laden. And on top of that, gas prices are going down as well as the inflation rate. So the economy is doing well as well. And of course, the vaccination rate is quite high in the US, and COVID is really not becoming that big of an issue anymore. And so if you look at the approval rating of Joe Biden compared to former presidents, yes, it's not great, but because of how polarized we are right now, it is not that terrible either. I mean, he is still more popular than Jimmy Carter in 1978. And if you look at the approval rating of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, yes, Biden has been underwater over the last couple of months, but he is now going back up and may actually overtake Donald Trump once again. And of course, in 2018, Trump was able to retain control of the Senate. And so now if we look at the polling for each of the individual Senate elections, this will be a bit shorter of a video, but I want to finish by looking at these polls in the betting markets. I mean, just look at the major races. Basically, all of them are up here. In North Carolina, we see an even matchup between Ted Budd and Cheri Beasley. Now, this is a race that Republicans should be winning in by a pretty significant margin. In Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto is up by 1.5%. In Georgia, 2.7% for Raphael Warnock. In Ohio, Democrats with Tim Ryan are actually leading by 4.5% against J.D. Vance. I mean, just look at a race like Arizona. Mark Kelly is up by 10.2% against Blake Masters, and of course in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman has a 10.8% lead over Mehmet Oz. The governor election is not any better for the GOP. In Nevada, +2 for Steve Sisolak. In Georgia, yes, Republicans are ahead. In Pennsylvania, we see a very similar race to the Senate election with Josh Shapiro up by 8.2%. Texas Republicans are doing pretty well here. It's almost impossible for Beto O'Rourke to win. And of course, in New York, we actually have a surprisingly close election between Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin. So most of these polls are very strong for the Democratic Party recently, and that is one of the main reasons why they're so favored. If we look at the 538 forecast for the Senate based solely on the polls, the Democratic Party has a 79% chance at winning the majority. It's 21 for Republicans, and if you look at the individual races, Republicans have just a 10% chance at winning in Pennsylvania. Raphael Warnock has a 65% chance of winning re-election. In Arizona, 91 for Mark Kelly and 63 for Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada. Even in the state of North Carolina, Sherry Beasley is now favored if we look at the polls alone. She has been doing pretty well. In Ohio, Tim Ryan has a 70% chance at winning this race based on the polls alone. And I want to finish off this video by looking at the betting markets for these elections. I mean, we already saw the flip-flop that happened in the Senate races, but looking at the number of seats that the GOP will win after these midterms, the most likely scenario is that they win 49, and 19% chance that this happens. The odds that they win 50, 16% chance, and of course, there are still pretty good chances they win more than 50 seats, but honestly, the numbers have not been that great for the GOP. If we look at the overall control of Congress, the most likely scenario right now, 45% chance that the Republicans win the House and the Democrats win the Senate, while the second most likely one is the one in which Republicans win both the House and the Senate. There's actually a 22% chance Democrats win both, but I think that is very, very unlikely. I do believe that it will be one of these top two scenarios. I think it's a very close margin, and that is reflected by these odds right here. And if you look at the odds that Republicans win both the House and the Senate, I mean, they have basically tanked over the last couple of months. At the very beginning of June, they had a 3 and 4 chance at winning both chambers. Now they have just a 4 and 10 chance at winning, and there is almost a 1 and 2 chance the Democrats actually retain control of the Senate, but also lose the House. And that'll be it for this video. Democrats favored in the Senate, however, Republicans are heavily favored in the House, and the governor elections are much more competitive than previously it seemed. And it's definitely a very competitive midterm as we enter the last 3 months until the election in November. And so that'll be it for this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.